bienvenidos a esta quinta, ¿cierto? La penúltima sesión de la Cátedra Gaos. En esta ocasión que la dividimos en dos periodos, antes de las vacaciones y después de las vacaciones. Es un nuevo experimento, a mí me parece que es bueno. Y también, digamos, había razones de orden administrativo para hacerlo así.
No se oye nada.
¿No se oye? Bueno, tampoco era algo importante lo que dije. Y ustedes estaban platicando, así que... Entonces, bueno, le doy la palabra a Manuel Vargas, que hoy disertará sobre accidentalidad y agencia cultural.
Gracias.
Dime.
Okay, can people hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. So just a quick recap. So I think there's clear proof that masochism is alive and well in Mexico because there's an audience here. This is, I guess, this will be the 9th and 10th hours for some of you of listening to me talk. So thank you for your solidarity, willpower, and tolerance. Okay, so this week the cluster of lectures are on the history of 20th century philosophy here in Mexico. And the lecture on Monday was about Vasconcelos and trying to save at least parts of Vasconcelos from himself. And that was the project of a people. Today I'm going to be talking about accidentality and culturally structured agency. So that's today. And then on Friday, I'll be talking about a set of issues that crop up over much of the span of the history of philosophy in 20th century Mexico. So it'll be a cluster of different issues. And for those of you who are despairing at the absence of analytic philosophy, you'll get at least 5 minutes of contemporary philosophy of agency, under which I will pound the table and insist on the truth of views that are like mine and the falsehood of all the other views. So we'll do a little bit of that on Friday. Okay, so today I'm going to do things a little differently than I had been doing. So I'm going to mostly read from a talk, but I'll have slides up and running as I go. So if you've downloaded the talk, you can follow along if you like, or you can just listen. All right. So accidentality and culturally structured agency. So consider two experiences of moving to a new place. In one, things are different but good. You adapt to the local conditions of life. Things make sense relatively quickly. You connect with people. You engage in shared activities. You form relationships you value. And although there are the inevitable adjustments and surprises, by and large, your life takes on a shape you accept and maybe even like. In an alternative scenario, those happy alignments do not come to be. Maybe the local conditions of life seem alien. The habits of daily life never come to feel natural. Relationships seem structured around activities or values you don't quite share, or maybe even values you repudiate. How people relate is, for lack of a better word, off. Now, a precise characterization of these misalignments can be elusive. In relatively mild cases, the misalignment is localized to features of a job, or a group, or some particular practice. More encompassing cases of misalignment leave one feeling more radically at unease with wider or more comprehensive swaths of one's milieu. In these more extreme instances, we might characterize the situation as producing a sense that one is ungrounded, perhaps normatively unmoored, in that it's unclear how to proceed, what the significance of one's choices will be, and what results will follow if one acts on the old principles in the new context. A paradigmatic case of this more encompassing unease is sometimes expressed by children of immigrants. They sometimes experience a feeling of disconnect with both the culture of their parents and the majority culture in which they find themselves. Ni de aquí, ni de allá, neither here nor there, is how it is said in Spanish, although the thought has at least as many expressions as there are languages. These stories of ungrounded lives, or ungrounded parts of lives, are familiar themes in immigrant narratives and the memoirs of members of marginalized social groups. Now, this is not just an immigrant story, or the story of their children. Similar stories have been sometimes told by people with social identities that did not mesh with the valorized identities of a community and by people who feel pulled to reject the valuational structures in which they were raised. These stories can convey a sense of profound unease or ungroundedness of a special sort that I'll characterize as accidentality. My aspiration in this essay is to chart some dimensions of accidentality and to gesture at some ways in which it figures in the lives of many people. In writing it, I've helped myself to some resources from now mostly forgotten, or if remembered, then oftentimes repudiated, mid-20th century work on existentialism from here in Mexico. The central idea in what follows is that we can usefully explain what's going on in these cases of ungroundedness by appreciating some important roles that social patterns of meaningfulness and value play, or fail to play, in an individual life. All right, culture and contingency. So I start with a discussion about culture and cultures. My interest is in what we might call normative culture. That is, the part of culture that includes packages of social meanings, values, and practical norms that in the ordinary case tend to be relied upon to address various challenges in life. We need tools, skills, and knowledge for navigation in complex communal life. Normative culture provides an accumulated body of these navigational resources, linked patterns of meaning, symbols, practical norms, practical values, and the like, which can include things like rituals and frequently tacit decision procedures. On the present way of characterizing it, though, normative culture is a linked set of practical, as opposed to theoretical norms, social meanings, and values that tend to travel together, often in mutually reinforcing ways. The present way of thinking about an entangled package of practical norms, meanings, and values is not meant to be tendentious. It's compatible with a range of traditional and oftentimes more expansive ways of thinking about culture. It's also compatible with the idea that cultural packages admit of some underdetermination about practical norms, social meanings, and values, that cultures can overlap and diverge, and that within a given culture, normative conflict can come in degrees. Whatever your more general account of culture, the point that matters for present purposes is just this. In a given time and place, the social world tends to present us with packages of practical norms, values, and social meanings that shape our sense of the world and ourselves, our valuations of the options that are before us, and our expectations about what kinds of social responses our choices are likely to produce. The significance of a particular package of normative culture is most readily visible in cases where differences from one's own local practices stand out. For example, in the European Middle Ages, the practice of charging interest, usury as it was called, was viewed negatively. The negative valence of charging interest was bound up in a web of cultural meanings, a commitment to the precepts of Christianity, anti-Semitism, and historically contingent rules about who could own property. The wrongfulness of charging interest was a contingent valuational feature. It was enmeshed in wider patterns of meaning that we tend not to share in the here and now. A more culturally proximal case might be recent shifts in how we think about addiction. The rise of the disease model and subsequent undercutting of the conviction that addiction is a culpable failure of volition and this, has altered many people's sense of the wrongfulness of addiction. The issue remains unsettled in popular attitudes. Social identities, both in the nature of the category and the kinds of explicit and connotational meanings of those categories, is also a matter of local packages of norms. Being a Protestant means one thing in 16th century Spain. It means something different in 21st century Southern California. Even for categories ostensibly connected to a relatively stable biological feature of humans, the import of those identities is culturally loaded. As the slogan goes, gender's the social meaning of sex. The social significance, the meaning of gender, and the number of genders has admitted a variation across time and place. In noting the contingency of given configurations of normative culture, we need not be committed to more sweeping claims that all meanings are contingent in these ways, or that values or moral truths are always relative to a time and place. Litigating disputes about historicism and relativism is a task for Friday. For my purposes, it's enough to recognize that many of our social identities, the significance of our behavioral dispositions, and the import of particular actions and practices is invariably experienced by individuals as saturated with a local meaning that's historically contingent. Two kinds of agency. So for reasons that will become clear to the reader or to the audience here in this case, in the discussion that follows, I'm going to do something that's otherwise terribly ill-advised. I'm going to use relatively familiar technical philosophical vocabulary in a non-standard, potentially obscure way. So let's let substance be agents who experience themselves as having relatively stable and unified packages of commitments about norms, values, and meanings. Characteristically, substances take their configuration of normative culture for granted. The particular commitments that constitute their normative culture tend to do an adequate or better job of guiding deliberations about what to do, identifying meaningful courses of action, and in general, helping people navigate practical challenges within their form of life. Let accidents be agents who are not substances. They don't experience themselves as having relatively stable or unified packages of commitments about norms, values, and meanings. The package of normative cultures that are seen to be available to them, perhaps culturally afforded in some circumscribed way, are not experienced by these agents as providing satisfying guidance on what to do, about what is valuable, and how one should think of the significance of one's choices. It's an interesting question, although one I'm not going to pursue here, how precisely to characterize the agent's sense of difficulty about what the availability of normative alternatives might come to. So I think on the one hand, one could think that features of contemporary life, including things like the fragmentation of narratives about what's valuable, might induce accidentality more readily than, say, traditional forms of life. On the other hand, it might seem that ready access to information like books, the internet, and so on, travel, can make accidentality more avoidable by providing more possibilities of compelling normative packages. So something to keep in mind, I think, in either case is that many norms, social meanings, and values require specific social scaffolding, though. So a culture that aspires to generate honor by dueling practices, for example, is going to do very badly if you don't have other people who want to duel with you, right? So certain kinds of social practices require cooperation in order to work. So let's put some of these ideas together. Recall the phenomenon I noted and started with at the outset regarding the unease one can have with various practices, organizations, or roles that one encounters in life. Relatively local misalignments between one's sense of being and the values and meanings of some practice don't constitute accidentality. Local, limited, or relatively narrow misalignments don't ordinarily threaten one's sense that one's overall package of norms, values, and meanings help that person navigate practical and normative challenges in everyday life. In contrast, cases of ungroundedness, those more profound instances of alienation from available packages of normative culture, do constitute accidentality. That is, someone is an accident in the sense at hand if the culturally available packages of meaning and value, including the packages that one has internalized, fail to provide ready and adequate answers to questions of meaning and value in some widespread and seemingly pervasive sense relative to one's own life. On this picture, accidentality is not about whether one occupies a position of social marginality. One might be a member of a marginalized community, but still a substance, that is, being able to take for granted one's deliberations, in one's deliberations a stable network of norms, meanings, and values. And one might also be a member of a dominant social group and be an accident. Accidentality is about the absence of a stable, taken for granted relationship to normative culture. All right, the psychology of accidentality. So that's a detail from Rodin's Gates of Hell. It's this fantastic sculpture for which the thinker's a little part of the, shows up as a little part of the Gates of Hell, but it's worth seeing sometime if you get an opportunity to. Okay, so accidentality is a kind of relationship between an agent and normative culture. It's a state of an agent who pervasively experiences the available patterns of norms, values, and cultural meanings as unable to be taken for granted, as inapt for practical reasoning. If accidentality is a recognizable phenomenon and its characteristics give us an identifiable kind of relationship of an agent to norms, might it have a characteristic profile and affect and dispositions for action? Well, here's one reason for thinking it could. If one is not relatively secure in some system of value and meaning, at least in a sufficiently wide range of contexts, then who one is and what one's sense of oneself and the value of one's actions is going to be chronically threatened. One still has to make decisions about what to do. One may still have some sense of self, but the basis of these things is going to be suspect. For an accident, the integrity of one's judgments about value is pervasively vulnerable to internal doubt and external condemnation. The pervasiveness of an individual's sense of ungroundedness matters. Again, minimal or relatively isolated discomfort about some set of practices is very different than the sort of ungroundedness that's at stake here. The accident's more global sense of skepticism about the truth of a system of local meanings and values may be prone to inducing the thought that it's all contingent, that maybe it's all potentially meaningless and without value. So we might think on this kind of picture that ungroundedness produces a kind of internal fragility about one's sense of self and one's normative assessments that plausibly may give rise to a characteristic psychological syndrome. Consider the position of someone unhappy with the operative gender norms in her culture. But she's also unsure about what an alternative would look like. This is therefore a different case from the case where one is clear and confident about one's gender identity, despite maybe, for example, the social world's willingness to recognize that. So for the person under consideration to participate in various social practices implicated in the objectionable gender norms may strike her as repellent. Norms of dating and marriage, for example, may seem polluted by those problematic features of the operative gender norms. Nevertheless, to opt out of those gendered practices entirely would also be costly. She would have to forego various goods that are enabled by participation in those practices. For example, to opt out of dating and marriage practices might be to opt out of otherwise good access to companionship, financial security, certain valuable shared experiences, and so on. Now, our gender norm objector could, of course, take a principled and public stand against the existing gender norms and their enactment in practices of dating and marriage. This stance would raise its own troubles. It would seem to signal a set of commitments to a different set of values, values about which she may also be wary. She may think to herself that she doesn't want to be seen as strident or ideological, especially about a matter about which she is not entirely sure. She faces an unhappy dilemma. For any action, for any position, either she will face criticism from without, or she will run the risk of acting in a way that does not accord with her values, values that may as yet be partial, unformed, provisional, or in ongoing negotiation. She might sit around imagining that the world regards her actions in different ways, or that she could create an entirely new practice, not complicit in the difficulties of existing gender norms. Unless she's also motivated, though, those may just remain mere fantasy. Even if she were to act on those fantasies, it might commit her to acting on and advocating values about which she remains unsure. Now, I think there's a lot of things we can say about this kind of case, but I want to focus on three psychological elements in the case as it's been described. So, first, a reluctance to engage in action in the world that might be meaning-bearing in a way that one rejects. We can characterize this as unwillingness. Two, we might talk about a standing concern for avoiding having one's social standing impugned. That is a kind of concern for preserving one's sense of dignity. And third, we might characterize it as a disposition for turning inward, a kind of introversion in the face of unhappiness about the unappealing actional possibilities. Now, in the following, I'm going to say a little bit about each of these elements. Now, on the present picture, on the story I'm sketching here, people experience the world as structured by a system of meanings, norms, and values. For the accident, though, the available pictures of meanings, norms, and values are not compelling ways to understand the world. Indeed, the ungrounded person may find the world structured in these ways as repellent. Action that participates in, that is complicit in those patterns of meaning, may even strike the ungrounded person as disgusting, precisely because it suggests a commitment to those frameworks of meaning about which one is skeptical. The result is a disposition of unwillingness or an aversion to action. The unwilling agent remains unmoved, preferring inactivity rather than taking up actions that are immediately bound up in systems of meaning and value that the agent does not accept. On the present proposal, accidents tend to be preoccupied with preserving their sense of dignity. The gender norms case I gave suggests one reason why. When an accident encounters an obstacle, a place where the world puts up an impediment to the attainment of her goals, say of achieving a less problematic relationship to gender norms, the accident's likely to be gripped by some unwillingness to engage. She may still condemn, of course, at least while in a position of normative uncertainty. She's unlikely to redouble her efforts in combating the effects of gender norms. She will not get engaged, perhaps in the literal sense especially, in the fight for a different set of gender norms. Instead, the pressure on her is to not expose her vulnerability and uncertainty about what's normatively authoritative. The accident has reason to avoid getting dirty. So the impulse to withdraw from engagement is perhaps especially prone to a bit of self-serving self-deception. Unwillingness is recast as a commitment to preserving one's dignity, one's unimpugned social standing. The accident's preoccupation with dignity may come to manifest a dual concern for, on the one hand, a kind of conventional rectitude, and on the other, a kind of detachment from advocating for a real concrete set of alternative commitments. Now, it's worth noting that although this account has framed the accident's moral rectitude in terms of a preoccupation with dignity, there are other values around which moral rectitude might be organized. We might expect some culturally specific loading for what values organizes one's moral rectitude, whether it's dignity or honor or generosity. Honor in particular might be particularly common. It might be a particularly common value in a range of cultures, and in a given case, it might also be the case that there's no single value around which one's rectitude is fixated. So the values or value around which the accident's rectitude may be organized might sometimes be other than dignity, even if dignity is perhaps the most common configuration. Now, the third aspect of the characteristic psychological syndrome of accidentality is a turn inward, something we can think of as an impulse to introversion and introspection. If one is averse to meaningful action in the world, and one is uncertain about whether any norms, meanings, and values are genuinely authoritative, one will seek to avoid attention or notice. I've already shown that this position tends to create a pressure to avoid external engagement. Any impulse to activity need not be entirely eradicated, though. On the present proposal, it's just turned inward. So the person in a position of accidentality tends towards rumination, maybe sentimentality, and as was suggested above, considerable reflection on alternatives that might have been. As noted above, accidents are plausibly prone to awareness of what we might think of as the existential condition. That is, there's an awareness that systems of meaning and value have an enormous amount of contingency built into them. Indeed, the old skeptical worry about whether all systems of meaning and value are at root fictions obscuring the meaningless nature of existence might be especially prone to emerging in those suffering from accidentality. Perhaps accidents are epistemically privileged about this, you might think. The turn to introversion and rumination may contribute to this sense of normativity being fictional. Preoccupation with constructing fantasy worlds, reimagining one's actions within them. These sorts of things may provide the accident with a sense of, new sense of possible values for one's acts and omissions. It might also serve to emphasize that the particular values and meanings of one's actions may be fictional. And on this permutation of accidentality, the person thinks that what she is a being that is essentially normatively ungrounded. That is, no available norms, meanings, and values provide a satisfying ground for thinking about herself and the meanings of her actions. Melancholy may set in. To sum up, accidents are agents who experience themselves as normatively unmoored. They're disposed to have a distinctive psychological profile characterized by unwillingness, a concern for a sense of dignity, and introversion. That profile is a product of an unresolved effort to embrace and deploy satisfying systems of meaning and value, and that existential situation tends to give these folks what we might think of as a melancholic demeanor. Strictly speaking, this picture is neutral about how, all things considered, we ought to think about a range of questions concerning value. Perhaps some anti-realists about value could go on to hold that accidentality is the price that one pays for an accurate understanding of the nature of values. All right, it's time for a little bit of a gear shift. The preceding two sections are a partial reconstruction. So what I've been saying to you so far is just a partial reconstruction of Emilio Uranga's account of accidentality, first proposed in an essay on the ontology of the Mexican, originally published in 1951, and subsequently revisited and extended in his Análisis del Ser del Mexicano, published in 1952. My account draws from an essay on the ontology of the Mexican, although the Análisis del Ser del Mexicano ignores some, or introduces some differences that for present purposes I'm going to just ignore. Now, Uranga was trained in the phenomenological tradition. He was a student of José Gaos, and he was part of the group of philosophers that took seriously the idea that philosophy was to proceed by first reflecting on one's social context, and that philosophical contributions were to be found in a detailed understanding of a particular concrete historical circumstance. The fact of Uranga's Mexicanness, I'm not just gesturing at it here because we're in Mexico. Rather, the fact of it is part and parcel of the very nature of the project he was trying to pursue. It was part of this episode in the history of Mexican philosophy to pursue a filosofía de lo mexicano, or a philosophy of Mexicanness. According to its proponents, the nature of Mexicanness, in particular Mexican being, was taken as a philosophical subject matter, as a spur to philosophical reflection, and as the best hope for a world historically significant contribution to philosophy from Mexico. That was 70 years ago now, right? Give or take. Now, at the time that Uranga was writing, there was already a tradition of psychological profiles that purported to offer characterizations of widespread dispositions characteristic of the Mexican people. So obviously Samuel Ramos's Profile of Man and Culture in Mexico is a kind of paradigmatic instance of it. It wasn't the first and wasn't the last, but it was an important one in getting the conversation going here in Mexico. What was different about the existentialist of Uranga's generation, though, was that they took the purported prevalence of a Mexican psychological profile to be indicative of a particular mode of being, as they put it, a distinctive configuration of historically situated experiences, meanings, and values. Now, my account of accidentality and the associated psychological syndrome left out some important elements of Uranga's own picture, and those elements are worth highlighting because I think they raise interesting questions about the extent to which a more general project can be extracted from the very specific project that Uranga was pursuing in the context of a filosofía de lo mexicano. According to Uranga, the Mexican circumstances, that is, the forms of life, the systems of meaning, the conceptual frameworks of people in those historical and national circumstances, was particularly distinctive, he thought. It's a historical accident, he thought, in a very literal sense. It's the result of a collision between two kinds of substances, Spanish and indigenous. But the ensuing society never generated its own distinctive substantiality, he thought. Instead, it produced a people who experienced themselves and their form of life as an unstable, uncertain amalgam of norms, values, and meanings that don't cohere well in the actual conditions of 1950s Mexico. For Uranga, this situation of ungroundedness was experienced by at least mid-20th century Mexicans, he thought, as a kind of constitutive or ontological insufficiency, or inadequacy in the form of their being. He thought this was a species of the general form, in the way they inhabit the world, and in the way in which their norms, values, and systems of meaning structure the world. To be sure, Uranga's account does not speak directly about many of the identity categories that had historical importance in Mexico. Here, all of you are probably already thinking, what about the indigenous, the mestiza, and so on? Nor does he recognize the diversity internal to those identity categories. His analysis seems to accept a picture of the Mexican Revolution as having revealed, created, or made possible a new kind of historical being that was the Mexican of his analysis. Now, partial or limit cases, including those that might reject the social and political order that made possible the sort of being that was his interest, is mostly passed over in silence, apart from some brief remarks about indigenism and Europeanism. But the interesting part for our purposes here is that, as Uranga saw it, ungroundedness tends to seek its erasure. That is, it tries to resolve itself into something else because at bottom, accidentality involves some awareness of the looming threat of nothingness, of non-being. The melancholy life of the accident is lived in a condition he calls zozobra, a kind of oscillation between being and non-being, what we might think of as a state teetering between, on one side, the impulse to accept a problematic framework of meanings, norms, and values, and on the other side, the urge to abandon that framework in light of its inadequacy at providing answers the person experiences as ready answers, reliable answers, or answers that are unreflectively apt. Now, the most common reaction to accidentality, Uranga claims, is something that he calls subordination. Subordination is an appeal to someone else's substantiality as a normative ground. So the idea here is that their packages of norms, values, and meanings are treated as justifying one's own being. This can happen directly and indirectly, he thinks. The direct form involves an embrace of a proximal substantiality, oftentimes a dominant cultural framework. So the immigrant who aspires to not only assimilate, but to assimilate in the most jingoistic way possible may be an example. The indirect form of subordination does not attempt to wear another's substantiality. This is the indirect form, has a different kind of profile. What it does is it seeks approval by those who enjoy substantiality. So rather than trying to take on board those features, it seeks approval from those who have those features. So one can aspire to be a nice girl or the bright, articulate, and clean minority. Whether direct or indirect, the net effect is the same. The typical response to accidentality reinscribes the normative inadequacy of one's accidentality, doubling down on the subordination of oneself to another substance. In the specifically Mexican context that was Uranga's interest, subordination, he thought, paradigmatically took on the forms of malinchismo and indigenismo. Here, it's the delight speaking to this audience. I don't need to say more. I can just keep moving. At this point in the United States, when I give this talk, there's a long, lengthy pause under which 500 years of history have to get unpacked. Okay, so moving right along. Beyond subordination, two options suggest themselves: value creation and nihilism. The value creation idea is as follows. One could attempt to resolve one's accidentality not by grounding it in someone else's substantiality. Instead, one could seek to construct a new substantiality, a new tablet of values, as Nietzsche might have put it. Uranga says little about this possibility except to highlight a deep problem for it. He writes that, and here I'm quoting, individuals who have projected a world and who have realized it eventually turn their gaze toward the foundation or grounds of those constructions, and upon finding them in the imagination are thrown into an incurable uneasiness, into an inevitable restlessness of finding the human edifice built on contemptible grounds. To construct a new substantiality, and here, that's the end of the quote, to construct a new substantiality does not erase the crisis for the person who creates that substantiality. A socially effective fantasy of normative realism is unlikely to persuade the person who engineers the fantasy, and that's the worry that Uranga raises for somebody who's inclined to that kind of strategy. A second possibility is a perhaps attenuated form of nihilism. That is, one could respond to the possibility of accidentality with abandonment of the aspiration for guiding one's life by non-contingent, non-subjective, absolute grounds for value and action. Uranga says very little about this, at least in the ensayo, in any direct way. At the same time, it's not hard to imagine that this is the looming possibility that animates the rest of the enterprise. He is, after all, an existentialist. The project of characterizing accidentality might be read as an account of what it is to live with the ongoing possibility of nihilism. The essay on the ontology of the Mexican concludes with only the slightest of answers to how one might respond to the fact of accidentality. He briefly gestures at the possibility of a life that accepts it as a neutral state of being. But the idea is underdeveloped. He gestures at the possibility of living within zozobra in a manner that involves something like the constant reopening of a scab, of living with the uncertainty of pervasive contingency. Rather than aspiring to a stable, permanent repair of one's normative wound, one might get by, he suggests, with these temporary knittings of a functional, if irregular and impermanent and always painful, normative whole. The metaphor is meant to be uncomfortable. And true to the spirit of the enterprise, Uranga just gestures at this solution, but makes no commitment to it. He only notes that providing an account of how one might respond to accidentality is a matter for morality, and thus outside of his ontology of Mexicanness. Now, here we would be remiss if we failed to note an important twist that is present in the ontology of the Mexican, but most clearly emerges in the later analysis. Uranga thinks that the accidentality of Mexicanness is not a problem to be solved, but something to be embraced and even valorized. The historical conditions that produce Mexicanness also produce a human type that he thinks is especially proximal to the actual nature of human beings more generally, or perhaps a kind of human experience that's especially well suited to reveal the actual nature of the human being. All humans are accidents, Uranga seems to want to say. Most simply find a way to deflect awareness or attention to it by immersion into some kind of substantiality. In the Mexican, the contingencies of history have created a type for whom the illusion just happens to be harder to sustain. Now, perhaps the most promising interpretation reads Uranga as hinting at the possibility that splits the difference between nihilism and value creation of the sort that one finds in substantiality. He notes that a concern for dignity grounds a kind of freedom, because the disconnection from the moral fray urged by dignity opens up a potential space for freedom and value origination. He thinks that this possibility has been left inert by accidents precisely because of the correlative psychology, the psychological pathology of the accident's disposition of unwillingness. So read this way, Uranga's aspiration is not to replace accidentality with a new substantiality. Instead, he aspires to live with an ongoing acceptance of accidentality. Now, if this is something like a kind of living with nihilism, it can't be total in its rejection of norms and normative force. There's a cautious normativity in his recommendation that the Mexican should seek to live in zozobra. In the later analysis, Uranga suggests that cynicism may be one way to live in zozobra, and it's an intriguing suggestion that exceeds the remarks that he offers in the ensayo. But it's unclear whether this is put forward as a solution or a strategy for living in a truthful way under zozobra. Perhaps this is one way forward. But the approach does suggest a way to vindicate the normative ambitions that underlie his analysis of Mexican being, as he claims that, and here I quote, "What brings us to these types of studies is the project of performing moral, social, and religious transformations with that being." Even so, it remains frustratingly elusive what grounds there could be for any recommendation that we persist in zozobra, given the kind of skepticism about normativity that's lurking there. Now, I think there's another puzzle here about how we're to understand Uranga and how we wish to make use of Uranga. Uranga's writing within a phenomenological tradition, according to which accidentality is a kind of experience of relationship to meaning and value. And this makes it difficult to see how anyone can be a substance if everyone, qua human being, must experience accidentality. However, if one is not wedded to a phenomenological framework, it may be more tempting to think that accidentality is about one's, in fact, relationship to value, perceived or otherwise, and that certain cultural conditions can make one more or less aware of that relationship. Whether and how this alternative reading of Uranga might be sustained is a matter I'm going to now turn to. So let's extend the account here. Okay. That was like 20 minutes of my life doing that little animation right there. So, okay. All right, so let's consider whether the reconstruction I offered at the outset, the reconstruction of Uranga I just gave, might cast light on a range of cases beyond those that figure in Uranga's account. I'm going to briefly look at 4 different cases. Double consciousness, what I'm going to call subversive substitution, transplanted accidentality, and biculturality. Among the most important philosophical accounts of the difficulty of navigating a social world structured by norms, values, and meanings that one rejects is W.E.B. Du Bois's 1903 Souls of Black Folk. A crucial idea in that account is double consciousness. Here's what he says about it. It's a particular sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One ever feels his two-ness, 2 souls, 2 thoughts, 2 unreconciled strivings, 2 warring ideals in one dark body whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. The history of the Black American is the history of this strife, this longing to attain self-conscious manhood, to merge his double self into a better and truer self. In this merging, he wishes neither of the older selves to be lost. Now, I think the parallels with Urangan accidentality that one finds in Du Bois are striking. On one way of reading Du Bois's idea, blacks in the United States face a difficult project of reconciling 2 conflicting frameworks of meaning and value, without abandoning either, and without either being fully adequate to that person's cultural and historical circumstances. The worry is that the conflict cannot be resolved. And if so, then the souls of black folk seem vulnerable to a condition of accidentality structurally similar to the one examined by Uranga. A different reading of double consciousness suggests another possibility, though. On this alternative reading, the essential feature of double consciousness is that one must always view one's actions under a dual lens of cultural significance. Even when a person feels no temptation to integrate the values, norms, and meanings of the dominant cultural framework, that person must nevertheless be conscious of the significance of their actions relative to that dominant cultural framework. The same act might have one significance under the cultural package that one accepts and another significance under the dominant cultural package. Moreover, oftentimes one might have little or no control over the wider social meanings of one's act. That is, the same act done by a different person might have a different social significance to it simply because of the fact of that identity in ways that one can't control. On this picture, the doubly conscious person need not experience estrangement from all or any framework of meaning and values, and one must in the case, as one must in the case of uranga and accidentality. The doubly conscious person might well be a substance, but she need not be. Still, there seems a greater potential for accidentality in people who, of practical necessity, operate with this form of double consciousness. Doubly conscious people may be especially likely to be aware of a certain amount of contingency about their condition. In particular, they may be especially aware of how vulnerable they are to not being able to live out the norms and values that they take as satisfying. Whether or not they're accidents, doubly conscious people are plausibly often proximal to accidentality. A different case, a case that may manifest double consciousness but that has its own distinctive profile, is something we might categorize as subversive substitution. And a story helps to bring out the shape of a case of this sort. So a friend and neighbor of mine, call him Jerry, because that was his name, was born in Korea but raised from an early age in the United States by his Korean father. He related that as a kid growing up in Southern California, he strongly identified with U.S. black culture. And he had a ready explanation for why. It was the best available alternative to his particular situation. Traditional Korean life was not an option for him in Southern California at that time. Relatedly, there was not enough social scaffolding for him to grow up in a more broadly hybridized Korean-American cultural context. Nor did he feel like he could fully inhabit mainstream U.S. culture, both because he was racialized as non-white and because too much of his home life was structured by distinct norms and social meanings. What was available, though, in music and proximal community was U.S. black culture. It was something he identified with not as a kind of cultural tourism, that is something to be entered and left when it was convenient, but as an identity to be strategically exploited to get certain kinds of localized goodies and then to divest oneself of those identities. And not as a form of subordination in the Urangan sense of deferral to the dominant identity group. Instead, for him, it was about being sufficiently rich network of values, symbols, and social meanings that could be enacted and shared without simply subordinating himself to the substantiality of the U.S. dominant culture. It was a sense of identification that manifested a subversion of or a resistance to two different forms of substantiality, Korean and U.S. American, although perhaps not without its own complicated relationship to the substantiality of U.S. black culture. This case suggests an alternative strategy to the dueling temptations of assimilation and nihilism. In it, the effort is animated by something like a liberatory strategy of recruiting existing counter-normative packages. It's not Uranga's subordination precisely because it's not an effort to seek approval from the various proximal forms of substantiality that enjoy cultural dominance. However, for it to succeed, the alternative cultural framework has to be culturally available and sufficiently rich in social opportunities to tide one over. Its enactment or performance may require some uptake or reception by others. Even if it's not a permanent solution, the function of this sort of subversion is to resist the omnipresent alienation one can feel with respect to a dominant culture against which one feels socially subordinate in some relevant way. Finally, we can return to some of the cases described at the outset. I began with cases about immigrants, and here we are again. So, of special interest are immigrant populations that can experience themselves as having a subordinate social identity. Of course, not all foreign nationals experience themselves as alien, as other, as having a subordinate identity in a cultural milieu. Whether these experiences obtain is presumably partly a function of whether those identities are externally marked or identified in those ways. What is of interest here is an interesting difference, I think, that can emerge between immigrants and their descendants in how they experience their practical agency. Consider that some immigrants do not experience themselves as socially subordinate in their new home, even when they're aware of the fact that they may be marked as having subordinate social identities. The now present cultural milieu may not afford them all of the familiar ways of living out the norms, values, and meanings that they bring with them from the old country, but this need not affect their sense of self in a way that produces Urangan fragility or a sense of normative ungroundedness. Importantly, substantiality can survive transplantation. Immigrants can bring with them an ongoing, taken-for-granted package of norms, values, and presumptions about social meaning. The local context doesn't always overturn that sense. The new cultural milieu can provide distinct, diminished but adequate, or sometimes even better affordances for enacting and expressing those norms, values, and social meanings that came from the old country. When this happens, the immigrant's sense of normative confidence may remain intact. It may even be strengthened or bolstered. An adult immigrant to the United States, call him Rogelio, because that's his name, once told me that he never felt like a minority in the United States, despite his apparent membership in a U.S. minority group. His explanation was that where he came from, he was a member of the majority group, so how could he feel like a minority? Taking him at his word, he lacked a sense of being socially and culturally subordinate. On the present account, we might say that Rogelio's prior sense of identity and the new local cultural circumstances jointly afforded him adequate opportunities for living out the package of norms, values, and meanings he brought with him. His substantiality survived transplantation. For him, the persistence of a non-subordinate identity may have been facilitated by the presence of a sufficiently robust community of people who shared an overlapping cultural framework. His sense of non-subordinate identity was not disabused by his experience in the United States. Had either of those things been different, so might have his experience of identity in the U.S. Even when substantiality survives transplantation, the immigrant may experience an increased sense of the contingency of one's relationship to the operative norms, values, and social meanings. Moving to a culturally distinct place just is the kind of thing that casts in relief the possibility of different arrangements of practical norms, values, and social meanings. Correspondingly, it raises the specter of a distinct social identity, a distinct fit between one's sense of self and the possibilities afforded by the social world. In at least some cases, though, it does not necessarily threaten the immigrant's sense of her default normative presumptions. The situation, I think, tends to be sometimes different for the children of immigrants and their proximal descendants, at least when they are readily marked out as members of some or another subordinate identity group. Under these conditions, it's harder to enjoy the presumption of substantiality, a sense of a relatively stable and unified package of norms, values, and meanings that reliably guide one's action in the social world. Why? Well, at home, the package is structured by the legacy of the old country. At school, in public, and much of the media, the affordances are structured by a different set of presumptions. A sense of normative ungroundedness is harder to avoid if one is forming one's social identity under these conditions, and that ungroundedness can come to be experienced as an essential feature of oneself. In contrast, her immigrant parents may experience any ungroundedness as fleeting, as a contingent thing that can come and go. For some immigrant children, though, Urangan accidentality may be more live for them than it ever was for their parents. Other accidental or near-accidental configurations are possible. Consider various forms of bi- or polyculturality, where this is understood as the condition of persons who have a sense of comfort with multiple packages of practical norms, values, and social meanings. In one context, one is Armenian. In another context, one is from Michoacan. Over here, one is a ruthless capitalist. Over there, one is a dedicated Christian. This situation is loosely similar to double consciousness. In this case, one identifies with all the various normative packages or with a life that smoothly shifts between these packages. The worry here, of course, is that the result is a kind of fragmentation of the self. Philosophers have tended to valorize cross-situationally stable, normatively unified agents. However, if one can withstand the psychic and rational demands of maintaining cultural silos or compartments in one's practical life, the pathologies, if that's what they are, of Urangan accidentality may not emerge. To be sure, oscillation between normative frameworks or living under an amalgam of distinctive normative packages can produce the requisite sense of normative unmooring characteristic of accidentality. The point here is just that the mere fact that an agent experiences a life as structured by discrete or even incompatible normative packages may not always produce the sense that there's no adequate normative basis for practical life. Now, this is one place where an analytic reconstruction of Uranga might come apart from the historical and phenomenological Uranga. If we think of accidentality as turning on the absence of a coherent and stable package of norms or the absence of being rightly related to such norms, then we might want to insist that an agent with sufficiently unstable, unintegrated, and inconsistent normative commitments is an accident, even if that person does not experience his or her life as normatively unmoored. Something like this sort of view makes it easier to see how accidentality just is the human condition, such that everyone is really an accident. In contrast, it seems the historical Uranga has to treat instances of bi- and polyculturality as cases of substantiality, or multiple substantiality perhaps, whenever they're not accompanied by a sense of dissatisfaction or zozobra. To take stock, the examples I've been considering, double consciousness, subversive substitution, transplanted substantiality, and biculturality, this is less of a taxonomy than a catalog of some of the phenomena that Uranga's framework can help illuminate. There are presumably other cases out there, including cases where people persist in the face of forms of cultural extinction, where Urangan tools might help illuminate the subtle relationship between lived experience, practical norms, and cultural situatedness. Now, it's not entirely clear whether we do better to think of the cases discussed, that I was just discussing here, as akin to accidentality, or instead whether or not we think of them as species of accidentality. I'm mostly inclined to think of these as species of accidentality, in part because of the cases considered above, at least in their paradigmatic form, are marked by these two interrelated features. One is that their bearers have a vivid sense of the contingency of their relationship to normative culture or normative culture or multiple normative cultures. And two, that in their practical reasoning, these agents don't take for granted a cross-situationally stable package of norms, values, and social meanings. Thus, on the present proposal, Urangan accidentality, with its characteristic psychological syndrome, is only one species of accidentality. Psychological fragility might characterize a particular form of accidentality. Perhaps it's essential to the Urangan version. But other forms of accidentality with distinct moods and actional dispositions can have divergent profiles. All right. So the foregoing is mostly proceeded on the presumption that we can usefully extract a more general picture of accidentality from the distinctive particulars of Uranga's own account. Whether that project succeeds or fails is a matter of whether the account accurately describes its target phenomena and the fruitfulness of that description. And in that light, fidelity to Uranga's particulars is entirely beside the point. However, the account I offered was also intended as at least a reconstruction of Uranga's of ideas in Uranga's account. So I think it's worth considering whether, as an interpretation of key ideas in Uranga's account, things go wrong when the notion of accidentality is disentangled from the project of developing an ontology of Mexicanness. There is, of course, some sense in which a more general project of a philosophy of accidentality is at odds with some of the particulars of Uranga's account. For example, the particular psychological profile Uranga offers is intended not as a picture of accidentality in any and every historical circumstance. Instead, it's very specifically a characterization of the psychology that he thought accompanied accidentality as it was found in the particular historical and cultural configuration of mid-20th century Mexico. Accidentality elsewhere might have a different profile. For Uranga, for example, a preoccupation with dignity is something specific to the distinctively Mexican psychological profile, he thought. He thought that different national contexts produce different characteristic virtues used to shield the accident from a commitment to action and wider valuational frameworks. Now, among Uranga scholars, several of which are in this room, thank you, there is little disagreement that Uranga's project belonged to a distinctive moment in cultural history. It was part of a shared project that took Mexicanness as a problem worth studying, one that proceeded from a commitment to philosophical historicism, and one that took many of its key terms and philosophical inspirations from the work of Heidegger and Sartre. However, within philosophical circles in Mexico, I take it that there's been an important political and interpersonal dimension to the subsequent reception and evaluation of Uranga and his work, and the present reconstruction has largely elided those elements. Right? So I've said very little about some of the notoriety surrounding this figure. Now, this omission may seem less than fully innocent. Uranga has until very recently been largely abandoned by philosophers in this room. I'm guessing most of you don't teach Uranga. It's not a part of your syllabi. Now, not long after the project of a philosophy, well, sorry. So I think that I think it's not an accident that philosophers in Mexico who were preoccupied with these questions, as opposed to philosophers in, say, England and the United States, came to take up some of these questions about accidentality. Even a superficial familiarity with the history of Latin America in particular, and maybe Mexico specifically, suggests that the kind of complicated cultural milieu that gives rise to worries about the possibility of accidentality and how to understand it is a kind of responsiveness to the real-world conditions that one found in the time period in which this philosophical project took off. Today, though, I think the wider project of a philosophy of Mexicanness, and you guys can just nod your head when I say this, is widely regarded here in Mexico as a philosophical dead end. Right? Yes, so I got a couple head nods. No? Okay. So some people are like, no, it is not. Viva la filosofía de lo mexicano. Okay, so here I'm going to just assume that the wider project tends to be largely regarded as a kind of philosophical dead end. And not long after the project of Filosofía de lo Mexicano was undertaken, philosophers began to raise serious doubts about whether or not there was anything philosophically interesting or puzzling about Mexicanness, whether the picture was committed to an implausible nationalist essentialism. Some of my friends in this room are in print saying the project was committed to an implausible nationalist essentialism. I won't name you. So to extract a standalone philosophy of accidentality may seem like a double mistake. It both separates out a project from its essential historical context, and after all, he was a historicist, so you might think that this is essential to the project. And it does so in a way that obscures the reason why the project was abandoned in the first place. Right? Interestingly, though, Uranga acknowledges that the core features of his account need not be limited to Mexicans and Mexicanness. As he put it in the analysis, any other character allows for the same operation, but my character is ready to hand. So it would be absurd to appeal to something alien. So while it's true that the extraction and generalization of a philosophy of accidentality from Uranga's wider project involves distortion, I also think it's faithful to a possibility he foresaw but did not pursue. It's also faithful to a possibility that his critics, I think, thus far have largely missed. The theoretical insights produced by pursuing a broader picture of accidentality are worth, I think, the departures from Uranga's own specific concerns. We need not think, as Uranga did, that Mexicans are the most human of humans. It's one of the most delightful things in Uranga. The question of who is the most human in the sense of being best positioned to recognize the contingency of the normative and of our systems of social meaning is, to my mind, a mostly idle question. Perhaps it's a question that admits of an answer, but that answer wouldn't tell us much. Whether Mexicans or Moldovans or Mesopotamians or some other country produces the people who are most proximal to whatever one thinks is the truth about the normative foundations of socially enabled agency, I think is largely immaterial. But one payoff of Uranga is that he provides us with tools for understanding features of culturally scaffolded agency that have otherwise been mostly invisible to philosophers. That so interesting and fecund a research project grew out of an effort at a regional ontology may suggest that we still have things yet to learn from a filosofía de lo mexicano and potentially other regional efforts at a philosophy of culture. Thank you.
Well, I really thank you very much for this extraordinary talk. I'm really so full of emotion and gratitude. I was reading the other day a book of a contemporary Spanish philosopher, Antonio Valdecantos. He's a philosopher of more or less of my generation. Excellent philosopher that should not be a surprise for anyone. Nobody reads here, I think, in Mexico or in Spain. And in the prologue of his book, of his most recent book, called Crítica del Naturalismo, Valdecantos says something like this, you see. It is about time, you see, that people in Spain, philosophers in Spain, start reading José Ortega y Gasset as if he was a foreign philosopher. read Ortega in translation. Read it in German or in English, you see. Because in that way, perhaps, he said, we will be able to understand him, you see, in its fullness. You see. And I think that what you have shown us today, you see, is how Emilio Uranga, beyond, you see, the details and the controversies and all the fights and struggles of Mexican philosophical communities, you know, which has it's invaded by all sorts of resentment and anger and envy. You see, can be taken. You can take away the value of that philosophy and examine it in a unprejudiced way. You see, in a more objective way. You see, and show how a philosopher such as Uranga, you see, can be considered to be a great world philosopher. That is, a philosopher that can show anyone, no, at any time, in any country, at any moment, something about human conditions. For many, many years, no, the very few of us that have worked on Uranga's philosophy have received within Mexican community all sorts of criticisms and misunderstandings, you see, and direct attacks. You see. The idea is that Uranga, no, has been covered, you see, Jose Manuel knows very well this, with some sort of myth, you see, a dark myth, no, leyenda negra, you see, that has reduce all his philosophical contributions to nothing, you see. And this is to some extent somehow systematic, symptomatical about Mexican philosophy. You see. We have not been able in the Mexican philosophical community, you see, to rescue the value of the ideas of our own philosophers, and let alone rescue them, I mean, but to develop them, re-elaborate them, reconstruct them in the way as you have done. So I think that the Uranga that you have given us, this Uranga in English, you see, this Uranga thought and received from the US, you see, it's just extraordinary lessons for all Mexicans, you see, and I think that this is what makes, particularly this talk of you here in the Gaos lecture, something that is very important, you see, because I really hope, you see, that Mexican philosophers, I'm thinking perhaps more in the young generation, I mean, that are here and that have listened to you philosophize, taking Uranga, as an instrument, you see, of that act of creative and original philosophy, you see, is someone that could as well, you see, help them to philosophize in an original, authentic way, you see. That is, to make them Mexican philosophers, not because they talk about Mexico, not because they know about the history of Mexican philosophy, but because they are Mexicans that can think as philosophers. That, as Kant would say, I mean, are there to think by themselves. So that is what just I wanted to say. I mean, thank you. I think that this is a very important contribution you're doing, not only to philosophy in general, but to Mexican philosophy as well. And that's it.
Thanks.
Efraín.
So I'm not as elated as Guillermo.
¿Ya? Es para la grabación, no es para... O sea...
I'll try to pose a critical question, perhaps to the original Uranga framework, and perhaps to yours, your extension. What I have in mind is the duplicity of substantiality and accidentality, right? So traditionally, these are categories that admit a distinction by nature, by structure. And what Uranga is doing, to my mind, is that he's trying to make a difference in degree. So this is my first question, if you would agree with that. And if you do, then I think there's trouble, or there might be trouble ahead. Because I don't see any other way of recapitulating the distinction unless you talk about ideal types. Like the ideal type of substantiality and the ideal type of accidentality. But if you talk about ideal types, then reality must be somewhere in the middle. So we're all substantial and accidental at the same time, or substantial in this sense and context, and accidental in this other sense and context. And I wonder if that doesn't pose a threat to your utilization of Uranga and its extension. I won't mention my aversion to Uranga's ideology, being very close to Díaz Ordaz, and we all know who Díaz Ordaz is, and so we shouldn't forget that. Yeah. I just wanted to say that.
Yeah, thanks. I think with all of the figures that I've been talking about, over the 5 lectures I've done so far, my interest in them has been in the significance of their work as a piece of philosophy, and I've not been thinking about them as the significance of their work with respect to their political commitments or life choices and so on. So, and I mean, this is actually coming attraction. So for those of you who are interested or concerned about those issues, I promise I will say more about that on Friday. And because I think it's a central and complicated issue about the history of philosophy in Mexico, is how to think through some of those kinds of issues. So I'll have more to say then. So please come. But with respect to the particular question about whether or not, if we think that the difference of substantiality and accidentality is a scalar matter, and my reconstruction suggests reasons for thinking it's a scalar matter, because you might think, well, look, that once you think that the issue is just about kind of broad, cross-situationally stable normative confidence, that if that's the mark of substantiality, then we can just start cutting back the degree of the breadth of situations under which it's stable. So I think it's a good question. It's a good challenge for any attempt to try to use or reconstruct these things. I guess I would be inclined to say, by way of reply, I'm completely happy with a sort of redeployment, or as it were, the analytic Uranga, according to which it turns out that accidentality and substantiality are, whether we think of them as ideal types or models, I'm perfectly happy to say, yeah, think of them as models for how people are related to packages of norms, meanings, and values. And let's acknowledge that when models have contact with the real world, there are going to be cases that don't neatly fit how the model works, but that's okay. The model doesn't have to neatly fit in all cases, and you can have threshold concepts where you have cases where we think it's more like and less like, but it doesn't really count as an instance of this kind until it hits a certain kind of threshold of cross-situational stability. And I do think that there is something that Uranga captures about the possibility of people who feel a relatively pervasive sense of normative unmooring, kind of ungroundedness, or a widespread lack of confidence about meaning and value. And part of what actually turned me on to this thing in a way that I hadn't thought about before. I mean, I taught Uranga a couple times when I was teaching a Mexican philosophy class, but I taught it to a group of students who were overwhelmingly Mexican-American students in the United States. And we were talking about Uranga, and one of my students looked up and said, "This isn't a story about Mexicans. This is a story about Mexican Americans. This is a story about us who grow up and live with parents and family who for whom it feels like it's not entirely our world, but then we go to school and that's not entirely our world, and it's the ni de aquí, ni de allá bit." And so I think that was the moment at which I thought, oh, no, there's something that Uranga's on about. I mean, he's captured a real phenomenon in the world, And so even if we think, look, it's a scalar thing about like how widespread, maybe for lots of people it isn't widespread in the same way in which it is for children of immigrants. And I think maybe that's a special case, and that's why I start with that case, that it's a particularly clear and exaggerated case. I guess I'm inclined to think that's reason for thinking the model is capturing enough and describing enough about the world that it's a reasonable place to start as we start to think about how to do ontologies of culturally structured agency.
Yeah, thank you so much for your talk. I enjoyed it so much. My question is not about Uranga. My question is about the kinds of accidentality that you mentioned, or rather your model of accidentality as an individual condition, not as a stage of a culture or something like that, but as an individual condition. And as I understand it, it can be provoked by very different things, like, for example, let's agree, living in Mexico, or being a child immigrant in the US or in any other country, or undergoing a transformative experience, or just going through some doubts about gender norms in your own culture, even if you're so a lot of things can provoke this accidentality, as characterized as alienation from any set of norms and values and meanings that is available to you, right? Like, you're not completely satisfied with any of them, you feel alienated, and angst can come from this, and very bad things can come from this, as existentialists have pointed out. But I was wondering about the good things that can come from this, and how optimistic you are about the role of critical thinking, but of a particular kind. Like, do you think there's any social conditions for joint critical thinking in certain, maybe depending on the conditions, depending on if it's Mexico or if it's like Mexican immigrants, or if it's, do you think anything can be done to improve the conditions in which people who are accidents together, in some sense of togetherness, in some aspects, people who are in the same state, being immigrants, for example, not only Mexican immigrants, or can anything be done that is more constructive at the intellectual individual level, not necessarily something openly political or territorial, but just can critical thinking be improved in any way that has to do with socialness of the people involved in these processes?
Yeah, great. So in some sense, this is the, well, I guess in the United States we'd say it's the $64,000 question. So I guess it's the, 130,000 peso question. No, wait, 230, yeah. Anyway, 300, and anyway, it's, I'm terrible at math in my head. So, so good. So I think, so, I mean, my own view about this, my own view about what internal to the framework of the analytic Uranga, that is my reconstruction of Uranga. I think, in some sense, this is the really hard question. The really hard question is how do you get normativity out of a picture like this, and how do you go forward with normativity, and there I don't. I mean, I know there are some folks here who are going to probably disagree with what I'm saying. I don't find a particularly compelling story about normativity in Uranga's own work. But that doesn't mean that there aren't compelling stories about normativity to be found elsewhere, whether you go in for a certain kind of intersubjectivism or, sort of collaborative reasoning, or whether you go in for a story about some kind of realist foundations of norms, or just convergence and calibration of our sentiments. There are lots of ways in which people could try to fill out those details in ways that I don't think Uranga, at least to my mind, doesn't satisfactorily do. But I think the part that the distinctively Urangan picture puts pressure on us in a certain kind of way that I think at least philosophers in the Anglophone tradition in which I was trained in haven't haven't really thought carefully about until very recently, really, is about the way in which part of any story about values is going to have to connect up with questions about meaning making and people being able to live and enact those things in communities, and what are stable ways of meaning making in communities that also secure the goods. And so these are things that are, of course, live questions at a certain level of description in political philosophy, and are live questions in some sense in the kind of the literature on well-being and in the kind of small rumblings of the redevelopment of a kind of philosophical anthropology. But I don't think there's been any good attempt to try to bring all of these pieces together into a stable story about, so what do you do when you've got a group of people who feel normatively unmoored in fairly widespread ways, and then what are effective ways of constructing systems that people can live with? And I think part of what Uranga rightly puts his thumb on is the question about whether or not what we should really want are in fact new versions of substantiality, and he's very skeptical about that. And instead, what would it be to live with, and to live in zozobra, as he puts it, and to live with a kind of holding any of these normative packages at some distance. And so I think that's in some sense, that's the super difficult question. I don't have answers for it except to agree that I think those are where the problems are, or I don't know the right way to think about them as problems as much as those are where real challenges are, and that's where lots of real work remains to be done. Thanks.
Hey. Well, just as Hurtado, I'm very pleased and grateful for this reading, this reconstruction of Uranga, which is, I think, interesting, relevant, and refreshing. And it is refreshing because you do not link Uranga to this political speech that was being built at that time. And in the case of Vasconcelos, it may sound like a big omission, but in this case, I think it's healthy, because we often here in Mexico force ourselves to make that link, and we do not do it in a very responsible way, and we tend to mix the late Uranga with this young Uranga, and we cannot do that, of course. And I agree with you that Uranga can be used as a response to the crisis of values in any given situation. That's great. And even though you mentioned this historical context and this moment for the Mexican thought that was Filosofía de lo Mexicano, I think your lecture may give the impression that Uranga was concerned that one of his main concerns was the psychology of the Mexican, and I don't think that's Uranga's thought. I think that he picks up the psychology that was around and he criticizes it. So he's not making a psychology. He doesn't want to do that. He wants to build an ontology. And it may also leave the impression that Uranga is somehow a binary thinker, that he's always thinking these categories, substantiality and accidentality. But he uses other terms, and that can be tools. You mentioned zozobra. I think zozobra may be in certain contexts more important than accidentality, or nepantla, or even nepantla. Because I think Uranga is one of the things we must celebrate of his thought is that he's a non-binary thinker. So he quickly moves from this distinction, substance, accident, to insufficiency, or to other words that imply some, I don't know how to say it, some kind of movement. So he anticipates even some ideas that Judith Butler or even Derrida will develop later on. So that's pretty much it. I'm really happy to hear you, and I'm really glad to hear this refreshing reading of Uranga. Thank you very much, Manuel.
Thanks so much. So, yeah, let's see. So a couple of different pieces. So on the psychology point, I think that you're concerned that the presentation I gave exaggerates the significance of the psychology that one finds in Uranga relative to its importance for his global project. I think that's exactly right. I mean, I think it's true that in both the ensayo and the analysis, there is a story of the psychology there, but it's not central. And I think you're right to note that that in many ways that's not where the original contribution is. And part of that is just because, as you know, he's just trying to find a way to fit in and to isolate where Ramos's contributions are and how to think about, because that's part of the conversation that he's picking up on and wanting to build and extend and transform is a heavily psychologized picture about Mexicanness. And so, and his principal, as you note, his principal interest is in what I'd be inclined to end up calling, though I think he thinks of it a little differently, but the social ontology that produces the characteristic psychology. But the characteristic psychology is not the interest. The interest is in the underlying ontology. So I think all of that's right. I think this was, so a fully historically faithful reproduction of Uranga's account would need to bring that out more than the particular version of the account that I'm giving did. And in my case, the motivation for starting with the psychology is, in some sense, it's an easy way in for people to get at and see the phenomena that I take Uranga to be talking about. And so that's why it plays the role it does for me. But I agree with respect to the historical version of Uranga. On the non-binary point, so I guess I think, so I'm inclined to think that this is one case where the Uranga of the ensayo and the Uranga of the analysis come apart. So I think the Uranga of the ensayo is, he talks about Zozobra, but Nepantla doesn't show up. Nepantla is a later piece, and the complexity about how we live with the fact of ontological insufficiency or accidentality gets a lot richer treatment in the analysis. And so this account was drawing almost exclusively from the story as it's told in the ensayo. But I think you're right to note that the sort of mature version of these ideas ends up having a different kind of story to them. So I think that's fair. Thank you.
Sí, yo voy a preguntar en español.
¿Está bien?
¿Está bien? Quiero regresar es parecido a lo que decía Efraín, creo que no es igual, porque mi pregunta no es la diferencia entre sustancialidad y accidentalidad es una diferencia de grado, y no me queda claro si la pregunta es para Uranga o para el desarrollo que tú estás haciendo a partir de Uranga, pero es lo siguiente, de que si ponemos el énfasis en lo psicológico, que es lo que tú estabas enfatizando, y que uno experimenta o vive la accidentalidad o la sustancialidad, ¿no? Si puede ser el caso que uno pueda vivir ambas dependiendo del contexto en el que uno se encuentre. O sea, si piensas en el caso mexicano, ¿no?, que es el que habla Uranga, si piensas en ese caso, uno puede tener la experiencia de accidentalidad, bueno, él supone que es la experiencia generalizada, pero en relación con otra sustancia, por ejemplo, si distinguimos aquí los criollos, por un lado, los indígenas, no los españoles, pero sí la sustancialidad criolla, ¿no?, o la sustancialidad indígena, por decir así, ¿no?, de los grupos indígenas. Por el otro lado, los mestizos, uno puede experimentar tener la experiencia de accidentalidad en relación, digamos, con una sustancia o con una sustancialidad, con la indígena, por ejemplo, o experimentar accidentalidad en relación con los criollos, ¿no? Y en una sociedad tan racista como la mexicana, como tantas otras, ¿no?, hablar de sustancialidad y accidentalidad obviamente no es el fin de la cuestión, ¿no?, sino algunas sustancialidades se perciben como superiores, otras como inferiores, o sea, la criolla se percibe como superior, la indígena como inferior. Entonces el hecho de que entonces eso mete otro elemento que hace más compleja la experiencia de por ejemplo, de la sustancialidad criolla, que se percibe como superior, pero que muchos criollos se pueden sentir mal por ser percibidos como superiores. Conozco criollos así, ¿no? O lo puedes poner en el caso de los indígenas, qué sé yo, ¿no? Entonces, mi pregunta más es si esta experiencia de una u otra es posible en un solo mismo sujeto depende la situación en la que esté.
Yeah, so this is a terrific question. So I guess I'm inclined to think So I'm inclined to think that the kind of relational version of the view that you're sketching is super interesting, and I'm inclined to think, yeah, that would be in many ways, I think that is a very natural way to build out the psychologized version of the Uranga view. And so I guess I think I have no objection. I mean, I'm inclined to think, yeah, that sounds really interesting, really promising, and might be the best way to try to build out the idea about how that story goes, if we're thinking of it in the psychologized way. And it might even be true even if we think about it in the less psychologized way and just about how one is related, in fact, to packages of norms, meanings, and values. That we might still want a relational story all the way down, or at least fairly broadly. I mean, it might be tricky on the kind of foundational practical norms side, but bracketing that. So I think this isn't in Uranga that kind of, or at least I don't find in Uranga that kind of complexity to the structure, but I also think there's no reason it couldn't and shouldn't be built out in that way, or at least nothing's coming to mind about a reason to resist it. So I think I'm just inclined to think, yeah, this sounds like a very promising way to build it out. And this is a terrific way to extend the account and build on it. So, yeah.
Thank you. Just a very simple question. So it seems that at least on certain level, Uranga is talking about psychology, and you focus on that psychology of accidentality. And I wonder whether it would be a good idea to check whether his claims on psychology actually match up some empirical evidence from psychologists about this specific state in which a person might be.
Yeah, good. So I mean, I think this is partly connects up to Jose Manuel's question earlier about whether or not it's right to read Uranga's contribution as primarily a psychological contribution, or whether we should read it as first and foremost as a kind of ontology. And then here, if you get worried when I use the word ontology, just put the word social in front of it and everybody will relax. I mean, I do think that that it's partly complicated in this case because of the sort of gap between the ways of understanding what Uranga as a phenomenologist is trying to do with a phenomenological project, and how the kind of ontology he wants to do is embedded in that sort of story, and then my extractive account where I'm totally happy to talk about social metaphysics and to talk about these things in a way that doesn't where there might be a characteristic moral psychology attached to it, but for which we can still describe social structures and social relations in their own terms. So I guess I want to hold on to the thought that I think we do badly to read Uranga as making a purely psychological story, because I think that's not what he intended, and that's not what the contribution is. But I do think it is true that he does have a psychological story, and he is kind of committed to a psychological story. And so it's reasonable to ask whether or not, assuming we could operationalize and identify and define, get a clearly identified population, and then to run run the studies and see, do we have higher rates of, and then insert the psychological profile. To my knowledge, nobody has done this yet. Somebody should apply for a grant. But I think it would be super interesting to do. And here, the only things that I can say that are that speak to this only speak to it anecdotally. And I'm not aware of any empirical data on this, but I don't see any reason why, at least in principle, somebody couldn't try to undertake a project to investigate this kind of thing. But here's the anecdotal evidence. So the anecdotal evidence is, this past year, I gave a version of this talk all over the United States. And it was really striking that everywhere I went, children of immigrants came up to introduce themselves to me as children of immigrants, saying, this is the first time I've ever heard a philosophy talk that was talking about me. And now, I mean, maybe that's an accident in a certain kind of way, and maybe that's just or maybe they're picking up on structural features and not the psychological features. But I had a number of folks who came up to me and just said, wow, like the as you were describing the psychology, it just really resonated. Now, I think part of the kind of jarringness of reading and talking about this in the context of Mexico City in 2019 is that it's I I guess I have no idea to what extent the psychology traveled well in 1950. Maybe even in 1950 it didn't apply to anybody other than Uranga when he was writing it. I don't know. But my general sense is that it's not super compelling as a psychological story of an entire nation of people with diverse sets of backgrounds and interests and so on, and different relationships to things, and partly because of the kind of relational complexity that Fabiola was pointing to, and so on. So I think that there's ways in which, if you hear this and you read this today and you hear the psychology today, there's going to be lots of folks with Mexican passports who are going to look at themselves and say, this psychology doesn't talk about me at all, and I think that's fine and totally reasonable, and it's completely compatible with the thought that there's nevertheless a interesting social ontology that has a kind of structure that he picks out, that when it does obtain, open question whether or not it obtains in Mexico, when it does obtain, tends to produce a kind of psychology of the sort that he described.
Once again, thank you for a very, very thought-provoking talk. También voy a preguntar en español.
¿Está bien?
Aunque son millones de cosas que se me antojaría discutir al respecto de la plática de hoy, precisamente porque es mucho un sketch de un punto de partida para pensar las cosas. Pero quisiera más bien pedirte, porque se sugiere muy fuertemente un diálogo entre Vasconcelos y Uranga, porque es claro que hay muchos temas en común, es claro que hay ciertos puntos de convergencia, pero también importantes puntos de divergencia, y me sorprende que no hayas explotado más después de lo que hicimos el lunes, más esa conexión. Entonces, que sí quería...
Well, yeah. Coming attractions on Friday.
Okay. No, yeah, that's fair enough. If that's all you want to say, I have more
Well,
other questions.
Yeah.
No, está bien. No, nada más era eso, pedirte más una comparación, pero si lo vas a hacer el viernes, te puedo preguntar otra cosa. Which is more of a continuation of Fabiola's point, porque en la manera en que tú hablas, la manera en que empezaste especialmente, parece que la noción de lugar, la noción de ubicación espacial juega un papel importante en la manera en que estás pensando sustancialidad y cultura y accidentalidad. Sin embargo, no queda claro, nunca lo haces explícito, ¿no? Nunca dices qué visión ves tú entre lugar y cultura. Entonces, la otra pregunta que debía hacerte era que hicieras esto a la manera en que tú estás interpretando Uranga, ¿no?
Yeah, good. I guess I'm running out of opportunities to say that I'll deal with that in a later lecture. But I will try to say a little bit about this on Friday, but it will be disappointing. That is in the sense that the issue is sufficiently rich and complicated that it bears, I'm not going to be able to cover everything I want to say about it at the time. But here's a kind of just advertisement about the basic line. So, I guess I think that it's not an accident that this element is both present and submerged in Uranga. Present in the sense that he takes himself to be explicitly talking about Mexico and about the Mexico of 1950s, and he's very explicit that that's the target. And there's little attempt to generalize it in the account itself, except to note that possibility that I quoted, that other people could do the same project too, but I'm here in Mexico and it would be silly for me to try to analyze the ontology of Uruguayans. So this is what he does. But the sense in which the relevance of place and the way in which place interacts with normative packages and produces kinds of socially and culturally scaffolded agency, I think this is super important. I think it's super interesting. My own work in my guise as analytic philosopher of agency is very much interested and concerned with those sets of issues. But I think it's not an accident that Uranga doesn't say much about those kinds of things, about the broader general project, because partly he's a student of Gaos. And Gaos is centrally interested in, Gaos is an Ortegian who's centrally interested in these questions about doing philosophy from a place and in a time and located in a space. So there's a way in which this was so much in the background presumptions that it's almost not worth mentioning because, of course, everybody in 1950s Mexico had read Meditations on the Quixote, and they were all doing philosophy located in a place. Now, I'm sure I'm exaggerating when I say everybody. I mean, there's some of you are thinking, well, no, there's that one person, but yeah. But I mean, that was the project. So more to be said, but that's the general thing. Okay, thanks.
Gracias por la plática y por la de ayer. Quiero un poco continuar con el punto, pero de otra manera. Supongamos que en realidad la noción de sustancia y accidente lo que nos provee son modelos de modos de relacionarte con normas, digamos, ¿no? Si eso es así, entonces yo entendería, después de todo lo que dijiste, que la noción de sustancia nos permite explicar, por ejemplo, quizá entre otras cosas, la noción de agencia culturalmente estructurada. Pero no acabo de entender qué explica, qué noción de agencia o cómo se relaciona la noción de accidente con qué tipo de agencia. O sea, ¿sería el no agente? ¿Sería el agente? No entiendo el papel que jugaría. O sea, si lo queremos extraer de Uranga y usarlo como un modelo más amplio, ¿qué papel jugaría la noción de accidente? No me queda claro.
Yeah. So, good. So I think it's, so I guess I'm inclined to think that this is in some sense an invitation to a much bigger and broader project than I was trying to pursue here. But I think it's a fair question because one of the things I was trying to do with the Uranga is to show how we can take the Urangan framework and then do things with it. So so here's what I guess I'd be inclined to say is, so look, it seems to me that we can characterize certain, what I would think of as a notion of bare agency, where by a notion of bare agency, what I mean is something like creatures with beliefs, desires, and intentions that are capable of undertaking action plans, satisfying certain kinds of goals, goal-directed agency, and then we can build that out in increasingly complicated ways. And then I think the story goes something like this, that in lots of cultural milieus, one of the things that oftentimes the fact of our socially learned practices, one of the things that makes those socially learned practices stick and persist when they do, is that they are effective tools for navigating niches or environments, and they load us up with a bunch of norms and ways of looking at possibilities and social significances that allow us to navigate a certain kind of circumscribed space fairly well. And when those norms get really good and really compelling, then and we can take them as received defaults and we don't have to be reflective about them very often, and that we just accept that package. Now we're substances. And you might even think there's a certain natural pressure for cultures to produce substantiality, because if they don't produce that, then people are going to keep trying to strive for things, because any norm that you have to keep rethinking and reinventing is a giant, this is a technical term, pain in the ass to deal with about how to navigate the practical dilemmas you encounter in your everyday life. So what's the use of accidentality? Well, I think one of the uses of accidentality as a category is that it helps pick out cases where so here I'm going to put this a little tendentiously, so a little more strongly than I'd be inclined to want to defend at length anyway. But accidentality picks out cases where culture's failed, where culture has failed to do one of the kinds of things that culture tends to try to do, which is to produce a framework of meanings, norms, and values that its bearers don't have to be reflective about. And so accidentality picks out a kind of failure state for culture bearers. And in that failure state, I think one of the interesting things that Uranga is getting us to think about is, well, it might be a cultural failure, right? So there's a kind of failure in the culture state, but it doesn't follow that it's an agential failure, that it might actually be conducive to certain kinds of agency. And here, the bare agency, belief, desire, intention models scale that up. There might be certain kinds of things that are valuable or important or living in accord with the truth, or pick a different set of values. But that accidentality enables, that substantiality moves us away from. So that's, I think, at least one conceptual role that is left over for why still hold on to talk about accidentality. It's not just that it's a marker for the absence of substantiality. I mean, it is that too, and I think that's maybe enough. We just use the labels in these ways, but I think it actually, if you link up to kind of cultures as providing and successful when they provide these kind of moments of substantiality, that would be one way of extending the account.
Lynn.
Hi, thank you for the talk. It was incredibly interesting. And I have a question that comes from deep ignorance. I wanted to ask you, how would a competing view of would look like when it comes to explaining the phenomenon that you pointed out at the beginning? So you showed the phenomenon of the person who comes from whose parents come from somewhere else. It seems like Uranga gives an account of what's happening in that situation. And I see that my question comes from deep ignorance, because I'm sure that there must have been Mexican philosophers who have given accounts of what's happening in that situation as well. So I just wanted to ask you, how would a different account of what's happening here would look like? I know it's not really about what you're not talking about all the philosophers, but I'm interested in how would how another view would try to explain this, and I'm sure there are examples of this in Mexican philosophy.
So this is a great question, and my answer comes from a place of ignorance. So that is, I don't really know. So I don't take it that a lot of people. So I guess I'm not aware anyway of a lot of philosophers in Mexico or elsewhere trying to think through this set of issues in any great detail. And I mean, this is one of the reasons why I find Uranga and his compatriots in the Filosofía de lo Mexicano philosophically interesting, is because they're trying to understand structures of culture and its relationship to agency in ways that not a lot of other people have done. I mean, so there's some work in other existentialists, but they're interested in very distinctive and interesting versions of those kinds of questions. Now, one natural place to point for versions of stories about some of those kinds of things that you might think give us the outlines of an answer to the kind of question, even though they weren't necessarily worried about the experience of immigrants, and for that matter, Uranga wasn't centrally either. This is just an extrapolation of how the view works. But I think one place to look is on the stories of that people in the 19th through the early parts of the 20th century gave about the experience of Latin Americans with respect to European colonization, and you get lots of versions of something like an inferiority complex kind of story, and this gets explicit versions in Samuel Ramos's work, but versions of that kind of story had been banging around in 19th century attempts to explain what's wrong with Latin America, and so I think so that would be one place you could go, is you could think, well, maybe what it is it's a where you lack full cultural competence, then you internalize a sense of being unpolished culturally in some or another way. Now this fuels a psychological syndrome, and now we're off to the races without having yet a story where, in some sense, you might think, here's the worry about those purely psychological stories, is they're getting their cultural and social ontology on the cheap. So that is, the relevant question is, but what are the structures that produce those psychologies? That's what we need an account of, and that would be some of the issues about what a contending account might look like. But this is all speculative. I mean, I don't have a standing view about what the alternatives look like, and part of why I think Uranga is interesting is because he's talking about this set of issues, or issues that flow naturally, or that are naturally upstream from the issues I'm looking at, in a way that not a lot of other folks do. So, yeah. Thanks.
Es una pregunta que tiene relación con lo que Efraín y Fabiola dijeron, pero desde otra perspectiva. En la última clase, tú comenzaste hablando de selective collaboration. Y pienso que ese adjetivo, selective, debería uno aplicarlo a varias de las discusiones que tú introdujiste. Por ejemplo, selective hospitality. Pero en este caso me interesaría introducirlo a accidente y sustancia, selective accidentality and selective substantiality, porque creo que si no, sustancia y accidente se transforman en esta manera de hablar cultural sobre ellos en una falsa oposición, porque pienso que siempre toda accidentalidad tiene algo de selectiva y toda sustancialidad también algo de selectiva, y cuando uno elimina lo selective, me parece que es una fantasía. En el caso de la accidentalidad es la fantasía de la total impotencia, y en el caso de la sustancialidad, la fantasía del poder total.
So, let me see. I guess I think it is not unreasonable to take the framework that I'm giving here in the reconstruction, what I'm calling the analytic Uranga here, somewhat tendentiously calling it that, but I think it's not unreasonable to take that view and then to incorporate some of these ideas about well, look, these models apply to better and worse degrees, and that we might circumscribe them contextually in these different kinds of ways, so that maybe the right way to think of it is a situationally specific accidentality or situationally specific substantiality. And I think these are all very reasonable refinements to this kind of package of ideas. And so put in the way in which, you know, if the version of the question is, hey, Manuel, do you have any objection to somebody who is interested in trying to take this Urangan framework and refine it in those kinds of ways, then the answer is no, I don't have any objection to that. If the question is, what would Uranga, or what would somebody who likes the Urangan framework that wants to hold on to the kind of centrality of these as explanatory notions and wants to resist the claim that it's a false opposition, what would they say? Then I think there's reason to dig in a little bit and to deny that it's a false opposition. So I think it goes something like this. Here's a good test for whether or not you are a substance. A good test for whether or not you're a substance is whether or not the distinction between substances and accidents seems to you elusive. Because there are lots of folks who, I think, go through enormous swaths of their life unsure how to think about themselves and their agency. And it's an alien experience for those of us who enjoy substantiality, because we just carry it with us. We're not worried about what's valuable. It may not be valorized by the community around us, but we don't care about that. We're pretty sure about what's valuable. We're pretty sure how to act in social contexts. We're pretty sure which, so I enjoy my substantiality in such a way that I don't really worry what you folks think about my accent. I don't really worry about my choice of clothing. I don't really worry about how I should navigate myself in questions. I just unreflectively adopt my norms. But I think there are people for whom they don't enjoy anything like that kind of confidence about norms and meanings and values across wide swaths of their lives. Not just narrow swaths, but genuinely wide swaths of their lives. And that can seem really strange and alien to those of us who enjoy confidence about our gender roles, enjoy confidence about our language and language choices, enjoy confidence about the norms in which we enact. So I think that's the kind of pushback that somebody who wanted to deny that it's a false opposition and say, no, these are really picking out genuine clusters of syndromes that hang together in explanatorily powerful ways. That's the kind of thing they'd have to say by way of response. But I'm not saying either of these things. I'm just here to tell you about possibilities.
Well, gracias, Pedro, por darme oportunidad de hablar una segunda ocasión, porque tenemos todavía un poco de tiempo. Quería hacer...
Quedan otros dos.
Seré muy rápido, entonces. Solo quiero hacer una observación de cómo muchas de las preguntas que se han hecho sobre Uranga y algunas objeciones, ¿no? Desde, por ejemplo, la pregunta de por qué no naturalizar lo de Uranga, o por qué no verlo desde una perspectiva más, social, racial, económica, política, o de decir si la distinción de sustancia y accidente es una distinción dicotómica, ontológica. Todas esas se hicieron en su tiempo en México. absolutamente todas. Por ejemplo, Santiago Ramírez, uno de los padres del psicoanalismo mexicano, dijo, a ver, todo esto de la accidentalidad, todo eso, vamos a hacer experimentos, ¿no? Para ver si de veras funciona así, etcétera, ¿no? Está la crítica marxista, ¿no? Que se hizo, la crítica ontológica, Villoro, que fue muy cercano a Uranga, que yo creo que siempre hay una influencia, que hay que buscarla en el fondo de Uranga en Villoro. O sea, él también dijo, mira, hay que hacer un lado estas categorías metafísicas, hay que hablar más bien de cultura, ¿no? O sea, la mejor manera de rescatar a Uranga es como filósofo de la cultura, no como un filósofo que está ofreciendo categorías de este tipo. Entonces, pues bueno, no sé, a mí me parece que de nuevo, para como un ejemplo de lo importante que es que en este escenario tú digas eso, es para mí la satisfacción de ver a mis compañeros, ¿no? Analíticos, repensar lo que otros filósofos mexicanos pensaron antes, ¿no? Esto es una cosa muy bonita, digamos, de la tradición, de una tradición sumergida que vuelve a salir y que está bien. Ahora, otra cosa.
The eternal return of the same.
Pues, más o menos. Sobre el neuranguismo, ¿no? Neuranguismos. Está Uranga y están los neuranguismos. Ahí puede haber muchos neuranguismos, como hay Kant, y puede haber neocantismos, ¿no? O sea, creo que he escuchado que hay algo parecido, y también puede haber, yo creo que Urangas y neuranguismos. Me llama la atención, si ya estamos en esto de las clasificaciones y todo eso, lo que tú estás presentando aquí, podría decirse, es un neo-uranguismo, ¿no? Desde filosofía analítica, pero también, y eso es lo que me pareció muy interesante, desde tu perspectiva específica como filósofo en los Estados Unidos, ¿no? No lo planteas tú así de esa manera orteguiana, pero los ejemplos que das, por ejemplo, la interesante comparación que haces entre Uranga y Dubois, todo eso pues me hace ver que hay, ¿no? ¿no? Y hay neuranguismo en Estados Unidos de un tiempo atrás, ¿no? O sea, está Gloria Anzaldúa, por ejemplo, ¿no? O sea, que es alguien que inmediatamente yo pensé que quizá iba a salir el nombre de Gloria Anzaldúa en algún momento, ¿no?
It's in the footnotes, I promise. It's actually in the footnotes.
Yeah, okay. Y que claro, que manejó la noción de zozobra, ¿no? De una manera muy interesante, ¿no? De una manera mucho más dinámica, menos dicotómica, ¿no? Se trata de una experiencia existencial que no está entre dos extremos, entre dos categorías fijas, sino que se trata de otro tipo de movimiento, rescata algo de ese Uranga del análisis del mexicano y no del primero. Eso lo podemos, si aquí está Alex que a trabajar, sí, que si lo ha leído no, pero la noción de zozobra que ella toma es una noción de zozobra que viene del pensamiento mexicano. A quien sí leyó Gloria Anzaldúa fue a León Portilla, y León Portilla utiliza lo de Nepantla también, pero tenemos que tomar en cuenta es que el Nepantla de Gloria Anzaldúa, ¿no? Es un Nepantla que viene de León Portilla, pero que pasa por la filosofía de lo mexicano. O sea, el descubridor, sin duda alguna, el descubridor de la relevancia filosófica del concepto de Nepantla es Uranga, y eso me parece que está como totalmente probado. Entonces, lo que te quería decir es eso, ¿no? O sea, que nos has dado también un ejemplo de un tipo de neuranguismo. ¿Podríamos en México tener acaso otros neuranguismos, ¿no? Y bueno, lo que estamos viendo es cómo el pensamiento de un filósofo como Uranga pues da lugar a distintas interpretaciones y a distintas perspectivas. Esto.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, so I'll just quickly, by way of response, I think it's absolutely right that there are a lot of ways to mine and deploy features of Uranga's work, and so I think he's very interesting for that reason. I guess I also think that there's I mean, this is one. I mean, again, coming attractions for Friday, but I guess I think one of the reasons why I think it's so interesting to read some of this history is because the frameworks of the puzzles and problems they're worried about aren't always the ones that we have in the 21st century, but they nevertheless oftentimes turn out to be unexpectedly useful and interesting for things that we are worried about today. And so this is one of the reasons why I love Uranga in this respect. But I think that any redeployment of any historical figure in a contemporary period is going to yield exactly this effect, where we end up with multiple versions of ways to make good on that insight. In one of my own subfields, you don't even have to go back that far in history. For people who work on free will and moral responsibility, the number of people who claim to be Straussonians, and that's like 62, 63. I mean, it's like everybody claims to be a Straussonian, but it doesn't mean the same thing for very many people. So I think, and I think it'll be the same with Uranga, is my suspicion. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm tempted to follow up the Anzaldúa thing, but I'll stick with my original question. So you kind of took race out of Vasconcelos and tried to say that was not essential to sort of the account that you wanted to develop from him. And you didn't really say much at all about race in your talk about Uranga, but I wanted to pick up on the fact that in your PowerPoint, the picture of the substance, right, was the kind of generalized white guy that you got from some stock image thing, I assume. I don't know what you can use without copyright, right? So in thinking about specifically the operation of what other philosophers have philosophized as whiteness, right? And I'm thinking specifically here of Shannon Sullivan in a book called Revealing Whiteness, looks at what she calls the unconscious racial privileges that attend to whiteness, and she calls it a form of ontological expansionism. So those are her terms. So that maps on directly to the way that on this kind of Urangan story about what a substance feels like when they move through the world, right? They would have this kind of psychological profile, right? They would be ontologically expansive. So they could come to Mexico City and they could take their Ubers everywhere and they could book, things through TripAdvisor experiences to quote unquote experience Mexico City. And they could do all of this without ever actually encountering a Mexican or Mexico in a way.
They would
right?
encounter some.
They would encounter some version of it, but they would be secreting their whiteness as they moved through this world, right? Such that there would not be a kind of encounter with difference, and there wouldn't be anything that would problematize their own experience of the world or the expectations they had going into the experience, right? So all I mean to suggest is that one interesting way that this project could be taken further, right, is we've been taking it up by the handle mostly of the experience or the psychology of the accident, right? But you could just flip it on its head, right, and say here in Uranga we actually have a quite interesting and forgive the pun, like a substantive account, right, of what it's like to move through the world as a substance.
Yeah, that's really great. I think the thing I like about this this way of thinking about it is it seems to me very faithful to a certain kind of phenomenon that was central to his the formulation of the idea of substantiality in the first place, and of carrying one's ontology with one wherever one goes, and not having it. And the world cooperating well enough that it's not contested, and against the backdrop of the intellectual milieu in which he was writing this, and the kind of collaborative work with Portillas off writing about social institutions and Sayas writing about the history of how colonization produces certain kinds of social structures and so on, that there's a way in which if we understand the project of the Filosofía de lo Mexicano as a collaborative project, this way of reading and picking up on that kind of ontological expansion I think is a terrific way of capturing a certain kind of feature about the account, and then lends itself very naturally to stories about to stories that pick up on and think through the racialized dimensions of these things. So that's a complicated way of saying yes, absolutely, this sounds great.
Bueno, pues muchas gracias, Manuel.
Ustedes, gracias.